Brian Jackson was a janitor at a five-star restaurant in New York when he was caught taking leftovers home to feed his sick son. When the head chef found out, he humiliated Brian in front of everyone and threatened to fire him. But just 2 weeks later, everyone there was working for him. Having finished washing the last dish, Brian placed it on the table and sighed with relief. The day had been very tough, and the man was tired from so many tasks. Most days, there weren't as many dirty dishes, but a celebration at the restaurant that day had significantly increased Brian's workload. However, it wasn't just the dishes that made him sweat from so much work, but also the dirty floors of the restaurant that he had to clean every day after his shift, taking up almost all of his time. Brian was about to leave when his attention was drawn to a tray of plates that customers had returned for some unknown reason. The food was untouched and looked very fresh and delicious, as if no one had even touched the meal. Brian thought for a moment and decided to take the food home. Well, I guess it wouldn't hurt anyone if I took some of this food, would it? It's already been paid for, and I don't think anyone will miss it, he thought to himself, trying to reassure himself. He had been working at the restaurant for a few months and was still getting used to the fact that some dishes were returned to the kitchen. Brian didn't exactly know why customers refused to eat the food they had ordered, as it looked so delicious. But this happened almost every day. Moreover, the head chef, Mr. Paul, didn't like it when someone got in his way, and knowing this, Brian decided to accept that it was none of his business and ignored these situations, focusing solely on cleaning and washing the dishes that piled up in the sink. Mr. Paul was an imposing and strong man, known for running the kitchen with an iron fist and ruthlessly. He was the one who took care of buying the necessary ingredients to cook the main dishes on the menu. With the calm thought that the abandoned and untouched dish had been returned by the customer, Brian carefully placed it in a bag to take home, as his shift had ended. The innocent man didn't feel like he was stealing or breaking any rules. After all, this food would have ended up in the trash anyway, so the fact that Brian decided to take it home didn't change anything. However, he was completely mistaken. Brian had 2 children waiting for him at home, and they were probably very hungry by that time of night. He said goodbye to a colleague, left the restaurant, and took the subway home, hoping the food wouldn't get cold before he arrived. The single father had good reasons for deciding to take the food. Brian's wife was the first woman to graduate as a firefighter at the city's fire station and earned the respect of her superiors in a predominantly male environment. All of this was due to her father, who had been a decorated firefighter of the highest rank. However, to the family's sadness, the woman died years earlier during the toughest mission of her life, a fire in a shopping mall that spread, causing the collapse of 2 buildings and leaving the city's residents in shock. As soon as the fire station received the call that the mall was on fire, Betty was one of the first to head to the epicenter of the blaze, aiming to save as many people as possible. It was thanks to her decisive and courageous actions that the number of victims wasn't higher. Unfortunately, on her last climb up the building's stairs, Betty couldn't save herself and got trapped on one of the burning floors, leaving behind her husband Brian and their 2 children. During the funeral and the following months, Brian felt like he was trapped in a terrible nightmare. While grieving the loss of his wife, he needed to take care of his children alone, who were also suffering from their mother's loss. The man needed to be strong and hopeful for his children, but as soon as they fell asleep, Brian sank into dark thoughts. It took about a year for him to adjust and gradually try to move on with his life. After all, his children depended on it. Charles and Thomas were born 2 years apart, so they got along well and could take care of each other if needed. The children were 8 and 10 years old, so Brian could already leave them alone at home when he needed to go to work. On Sundays, neighbors took care of the children, but Brian didn't feel comfortable asking for help often. Trying to support the family, Brian changed jobs several times, always hoping to find a better position. Despite his humble background, he had always been an enlightened and determined young man, the type everyone looked at and said would have a bright future. Due to his good grades and dedication in high school, Brian earned a scholarship to study business administration at one of the country's top colleges. The young man was excited, and it seemed like this was the beginning of a positive turn in his professional life. But it all fell apart when Charles, his first son, was born. Coming from a poor family with no one to ask for help, Brian was forced to drop out of college and start working to cover the newborn's expenses. At the time, his wife's dream of becoming a firefighter was still just an idea. Now, after overcoming the year-long grief, Brian had found jobs as a pizza delivery driver, doorman, and even a gas station attendant. But each job had its disadvantages. Either the salary was too low, or the working conditions were simply unbearable. When Brian had lost hope of finding a suitable position, luck smiled upon him. He found a job that paid a little more than the previous ones. The promising young man was hired almost immediately after an interview with the restaurant's manager, a mature businessman. To Brian's surprise, washing dishes at the restaurant wasn't as difficult as it seemed at first, but the rest of the cleaning was unimaginable work. He never imagined that a large place like that required its floors to be washed every day, and that it was solely his job to do at the end of each shift. Not to mention the staff bathroom, which, no matter what he did, remained completely filthy. Approaching his house, Brian saw the lights in the windows and his heart filled with joy. "My boys are still awake," the man thought, smiling. As he opened the door, he immediately saw Charles and Thomas, who ran to hug him and tell him about their day. Dad, Thomas's chest started hurting again. "He asked me not to tell you, but he was crying a lot," Charles said, hiding his eyes in guilt. Brian's smile faded as he anxiously looked at his eldest son. Thomas had a heart condition that had left him in pain for several months. Brian found out that his son had developed a dangerous condition a year ago during a routine checkup. At the consultation, the cardiologist looked down and told Brian that the boy needed heart surgery. "Look, I know your story, Brian. Everyone here in the area knows what happened to your wife, so I must warn you that this treatment is quite expensive. You need to be prepared for that. The surgery should cost a little over $12,000, plus the post-operative medications," the doctor said, handing a paper with the address of the hospital that could perform the surgery. Leaving the doctor's office, Brian knew he needed to find the money for Thomas's surgery as quickly as possible. After all, his eldest son's life was at stake. When he did the math at home, Brian discovered it would take 2 years of saving and strict financial discipline to raise the money for the surgery. If he could bring food from the restaurant home more often, this time would be even shorter. It wasn't an absurd amount, he thought, but the constant pain that Thomas felt was getting stronger, and the uncertainty of how much longer he could endure it haunted the widowed father. Brian placed the restaurant's food on the table for his children to eat and went to the bathroom for a well-deserved shower. After all, the next day, he would have another day full of dirty dishes and cleaning. But when Brian showed up at the restaurant the next morning, Chef Paul was waiting for a not-so-delicate conversation in front of all the other employees. "I know you took the leftover food last night. Do you think I'm an idiot? That you could steal the food I made so easily? Shame on you, you lazy bum. My recipes aren't the kind a janitor can eat. I think you better understand your position here, because next time, you'll be out on the street without a second thought," Chef Paul said, knocking empty plates to the ground and demanding that Brian clean up the mess. Brian held back with all his strength not to react and respond to those insults. He wasn't the type who didn't know how to stand up for himself, but he had to swallow it out of fear of losing his job. If he got fired, he wouldn't even have money to pay his rent, let alone for his son's surgery. However, Brian felt he needed to take the risk of taking the leftovers home, so he began to be more careful when doing it. Every day, he anxiously waited for customers to send back some orders so he could take them home and feed his children again. To Brian's joy, customers sent dishes back to the kitchen every day, and this lasted for about a month until the restaurant's new manager asked the janitor to come to her office. Elizabeth Williams was a businesswoman around 35 years old who made sure to keep everything under personal control and knew the value of every dollar she earned, being very dedicated to her business since taking over. So, on a non-operating day, Elizabeth decided to install security cameras in the restaurant to find out why the establishment was losing money. For obvious reasons, she didn't tell any of her employees about it. Seeing the humble janitor literally trembling with fear in her office, Elizabeth immediately began questioning, "Mr. Brian, I only have one question for you. What exactly was in your bag when you left the restaurant last night? Remember, lying is not an option, as I have everything on video." The restaurant owner's words deeply scared Brian, leaving him with no way out. Finally composing himself, he whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I had leftovers from the kitchen in my bag. The food that customers sent back to the kitchen that was going to be thrown away. Elizabeth looked at the young man and sighed in relief, changing her expression from anger to compassion, asking, "Did you take it for your dog or for a homeless person?" Brian's eyes filled with tears as he told the truth to the restaurant owner. Despite not being easily moved, the idea that in the 21st century, someone would need to feed their children with restaurant leftovers seemed incomprehensible to the businesswoman. But what she discovered shortly after turned her life upside down. "I really had no choice, to be honest. My wife was a firefighter and died during the big city fire mission. Additionally, my eldest son has a heart problem. He needs surgery, so I need to save every penny to raise money for that," the young man added, wiping his tears. Elizabeth looked surprised at the young janitor and then asked a very strange question. "You said your wife was a firefighter and died in that city fire. Is that true?" The woman heard the young man's response. "Yes, her name was Betty, ma'am, and she was the first female firefighter to arrive at the mall that day." Elizabeth stepped back sadly in response and sank into her chair, rubbing her eyes with her fingers. Her face showed genuine concern, which caused Brian to have an anxiety attack. When the businesswoman finally composed herself, she explained. A few years ago, her mother had passed away after a long battle with cancer. Elizabeth's father didn't handle the loss well, and his health and mobility deteriorated terribly, forcing the elderly man to live in a wheelchair and depend on someone 24 hours a day. Elizabeth then hired a caregiver for her father and, to ensure her father's legacy wouldn't be destroyed, took over the restaurants of the mature businessman. She deeply loved her father, and her biggest nightmare was losing him. So she always consulted him for any decision she had to make and had the elderly man as her mentor. But it was on August 13th that Elizabeth's heart almost stopped. Her father was undergoing treatment at a clinic inside a mall, the same one that caught fire, and his appointment was happening right at the time of the fire. The elderly man's caregiver, who was with him, died trapped in the rubble, but as if by a miracle, Elizabeth's father was saved. From that day on, the elderly man always insisted that a true angel saved him. He repeatedly said that a firefighter came out of the flames and rescued him, throwing him onto a trampoline meters below. It all happened so quickly that he didn't even have the chance to ask her name, as the woman ran back into the flames to rescue others. Now, beside the young widower, Elizabeth had no idea if the woman who saved her father was Brian's wife, but it didn't matter. She felt she needed to repay the effort of that woman, who died saving lives, by helping her sick son. Shaking Brian's hand, the businesswoman promised to help him. At the same time, Elizabeth also saw an opportunity to trust someone and use it to her advantage. She said she was suspicious of Chef Paul and asked Brian to keep an eye on him and report any strange behavior. The young man, always very insightful, agreed. After all, their relationship had become terrible. For 2 weeks, Brian overheard the chef's phone conversations and even discreetly followed him when he received deliveries at the back of the restaurant. In a short time, he connected the dots and discovered everything. The chef had a friend supplier who overcharged for ingredients and seasonings. This way, he bought low-quality products at higher than usual prices, diverting all the money for his own pocket. Since the quality of the food was below the expected level for a 5-star restaurant, customers ended up returning a lot of food to the kitchen. After a deeper investigation by Elizabeth and her lawyers, all the information provided by Brian proved true, and Chef Paul was immediately fired and prosecuted. Elizabeth also listened to Brian's suggestions on how to reduce costs and improve service quality, ideas he had always had since starting to work there but had no one to tell. In the same week, Elizabeth personally called one of the best heart surgeons in the city. In one go, she transferred the full amount for the surgery and requested maximum urgency for the case. Then, she called Brian to give him the news. "Hey, young man, celebrate. Your son will survive and see the bright future his father has ahead. Tell him you'll be the new manager of this unit you've spent months cleaning, as long as you go back to college. Now let's see if customers will keep sending intact dishes back to the kitchen." Brian didn't know whether to cry or laugh, and could only thank the blessing of having found that woman in his life. He hung up the phone and, in tears, hugged his children. After the surgery, the boy recovered quickly, surprising even the doctors. Elizabeth and Brian kept in touch even after business meetings, allowing Brian to introduce her to his children. When Elizabeth's father heard that the new restaurant manager was doubling the business's profits in just a few months, he wanted to meet the young man. It was during a park outing that they met and chatted. It was then that the former janitor, by chance, took a photo of his late wife from his wallet and showed it to the elderly man. Paralyzed and with tears in his eyes, the elderly man simply said, "My angel, my angel." If you like the story, please give it a like. And this other video appearing on the screen now will probably move you as well. Enjoy the session and see you in the next video.